All right, so you want to dive into Stalinist history. Buckle up, because this deep dive, it's going to challenge what you thought you knew about Stalin. We're tackling blood lies. The evidence that every accusation against Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union in Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands is false. By Grover Furr, and let me
Okay.
tell you, Furr doesn't hold back. He's taking on Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which is a pretty influential book in modern history. So are you ready to get into this?
Yeah, what I find really interesting is Furr basically takes Bloodlands, a book that's won all these awards and has this international acclaim, and he's like, wait a second, let's look at this closely. He calls Snyder's whole approach the anti-Stalin paradigm. Basically, the view that Stalin was this brutal dictator
Hmm.
who was responsible for like unimaginable atrocities, forced famine, mass executions, all of that.
So is he saying that this whole evil Stalin thing is basically just propaganda?
Well, Furr argues that a lot of what we think we know about Stalin is based on Khrushchev's denunciation of him back in '56, the
Yeah.
secret speech. And then this idea of Stalin as this monster, it gained even more traction with Gorbachev's glasnost and all that. And those are obviously really important moments in history. But first point is, we need to be careful about just accepting those narratives without question.
Okay, so where does Bloodlands fit into all of this?
So Bloodlands, it talks about all this horrific violence and mass killings in Eastern Europe in the 20th century, this region that Snyder calls the Bloodlands. And Snyder argues that both the Nazis and the Soviets were responsible for these atrocities. But Furr's really focused on what Snyder says about Stalin and the Soviet Union during this period.
So Furr sees Bloodlands as like the ultimate example of this, like you said, anti-Stalin paradigm. And she seemed to have some really strong opinions about Snyder's book. What's his main problem with it?
He goes really deep. Like, he picks apart Snyder's footnotes,
Yeah.
examines the translations, and he even claims there's some stuff that Snyder just left out. He says Snyder cherry-picks his sources and, like, twists the facts to fit this narrative he already had in mind. And it's more than just an academic disagreement. First saying that Snyder is straight-up misrepresenting history.
Wow, okay. So Furr isn't messing around. He's not just disagreeing with Snyder's conclusions. He's saying Snyder's whole method is flawed. And it sounds like Furr is really thorough in his research. What makes him such a stickler for the details?
Well, Furr has basically dedicated his career
Mm-hmm.
to challenging this, what he sees as this demonization of Stalin. He really believes that if you look at the primary sources, it tells a different story, not this, like, universally accepted narrative of Stalin as this ruthless tyrant. So he's digging through archives, government documents, first-hand accounts, to back up his claims.
Okay, so it seems like we have a real historical mystery on our hands here. On the one hand, you have Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, this really chilling account of the suffering and the cruelty in Eastern Europe. And then on the other, you have Grover Furr's Blood Lies, this book that's questioning that whole narrative. So get ready, because things are about to get really interesting.
As we dig deeper into Furr's claims. Oh, so first, Snyder is loose with the facts, but where's the proof? What makes him say, gotcha? Well, one of the most interesting examples is this story about this guy, Petro Velsdy. So picture this. You've got this Ukrainian peasant. He's totally devastated by the famine. Like, we're talking absolutely ravaged. So much so that he just gives up. And he actually digs his own grave. I mean, can you imagine?
It's like straight out of a horror movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Snyder uses this story to show how brutal this man-made famine was.
Okay, but I'm guessing there's more to this story.
Oh, yeah. Furr being Furr. He's not just going to take Snyder's word for it. He goes back to the original source, which was this one paragraph in a Ukrainian book of testimonials from the famine back in 1932-33.
Yeah.
And it turns out Snyder amped up the story quite a bit.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Like, he adds details about starvation, weakness, even this whole thing about the guy, like, dragging himself through the village.
Wow.
None of which is in the original account.
So he's embellishing.
I mean, you could say that
fit the narrative.
exactly
Okay.
by adding those details. Snyder's turning a kind of simple story about a guy preparing for death
Yeah,
into this, like, big dramatic thing about the famine.
I see.
It's not just death anymore. It's deliberate starvation. It's a whole regime that's letting its people die.
It's like he's making it seem worse than it was.
Right.
And that's just one example.
Yeah, and it gets even more intense. Because Furr claims that Snyder's using this thing called the big lie technique.
The big lie.
Yeah,
Wait, is that?
it sounds crazy, but Furr actually compares Snyder's tactics to Nazi propaganda.
Oh, wow.
I know, right?
That seems like a stretch.
It does sound extreme. But Furr says this big lie idea, it's based on this really effective propaganda tactic. The idea is that you repeat a lie so many times, with so much conviction, that eventually people will just believe it. And Furr's saying that Snyder does this by constantly repeating this phrase, man-made famine, even when the evidence isn't really that clear.
So it's like he's planting the idea in your head,
Exactly.
even if he doesn't have the proof.
Right. By saying man-made famine over and over, Snyder's making you think that Stalin was this evil mastermind who was purposely starving his own people, even if that's not exactly what the history shows.
Interesting.
And there's more. He also criticizes Snyder's take on the Soviet Union's grain exports during the famine.
Oh, yeah, this is where it gets really complicated.
It is, but it's super important for understanding the whole debate.
Okay, so walk me through it.
So Snyder's argument is, Stalin knew that millions of people were starving, but he kept exporting grain anyway.
So it was like a genocide.
Yeah, that's the implication, that Stalin was intentionally starving his own people. But then Furr comes in with a totally different perspective.
Really? What does he say?
He did his research. He went deep into the Soviet archives, and he found all this data that suggests something completely different. He says that the Soviet government actually reduced grain exports during the famine. And not only that, he says they actually imported grain and other food to try to help the starving people.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a completely different picture.
So he's saying that they weren't trying to starve people.
Right. He's saying they were trying to help.
That's a big claim.
It is. And he's got evidence to back it up. He found all these internal Soviet documents that showed that the leadership was really concerned about the famine. And they were actually criticizing local officials for not handling the situation well. And they were trying to send aid and find solutions. It doesn't sound like the cold-hearted Stalin we always hear about, does it?
It really doesn't. So it's not as clear-cut as Snyder makes it seem.
No, it's definitely more nuanced than that.
Are there any other examples?
Of where Furr and Snyder disagree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's the whole thing about the Polish operation.
What was that?
So this was in the 1930s. The Soviets launched this campaign targeting people they thought were Polish spies and saboteurs living in the USSR.
Okay.
And Snyder presents this as another example of Stalin's paranoia and his desire to eliminate entire groups of people. But Furr has a different interpretation.
I bet he does.
He argues that the Polish operation, while it was definitely harsh, was a response to a real threat.
Like what?
He points to evidence of actual Polish espionage, Polish nationalist groups operating within the Soviet Union, even Polish military plans that included invading Soviet territory.
So he's saying it wasn't random.
Right. He's saying Stalin believed there was a real threat, and he was reacting to that threat.
Interesting. So is Furr saying that everything Snyder says about Stalin is wrong?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated.
Okay, so we've got this whole debate about the famine, the Polish operation. All this evidence that Furr says was misinterpreted. So what's the bottom line? What's Furr's main point?
Basically, he's saying that the famine of 1932-33, the one that's often called a genocide or orchestrated by Stalin, Furr says it wasn't intentional.
Well, hold on. He's saying it wasn't like a calculated act of cruelty, that Stalin wasn't trying to wipe out the Ukrainians.
Yeah, that's his argument. He says there were all these other factors,
Yeah.
like widespread drought, massive crop failures, and just bad agricultural management. He says those were the real reasons for the famine. He's not saying that the Soviet government did everything right, though. He knows their response wasn't perfect. But he says they did try to help.
Okay, but what about all the evidence that seems to suggest it was deliberate? What about all the stories about the suffering and the brutality?
Right. He's not dismissing those stories. He's just saying we need to understand them in context. For example, he says that some of the most shocking accounts were actually spread by Nazi propagandists.
Who obviously had their own reasons for wanting to make the Soviets look bad.
Exactly. And even some of the true stories of suffering, he says those were often exaggerated by people who were trying to make Stalin look like a monster.
Okay, so if we entertain this perspective for a second, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about this whole debate?
It's about how we approach history.
What do you mean?
We have to remember that history is rarely black and white. There's always more than one side to the story. And it's so important to question the dominant narrative, even if it seems like everyone already agrees on it.
It's like that saying, history is written by the victors.
Exactly. And in this case, the victors, or at least the loudest voices, they painted Stalin as the ultimate villain. But what Furr is doing, whether you agree with him or not, is making us confront that narrative. He's making us dig deeper, look for other explanations. And that's what's so important. Because if we're willing to question what we thought we knew about something like the Holodomor, what else should we be questioning?
It makes you think. Like maybe there's more to every story than we realize.
Right. This deep dive into Furr's blood lies, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. It's a reminder to think critically, question what we hear, and be open to different interpretations of the past.
Well said. It sounds like we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've gone deep into Stalinist history, explored a perspective that challenges the usual narrative, and hopefully gained a new appreciation for just how complex history can be. So to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that spirit of critical thinking alive as you continue to explore the mysteries of the past.